Following a lapse in funding, members of the House are pushing to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act.
Last week, Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass and Republican Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick introduced a measure which would fund and expand the programs for survivors of domestic violence. That legislation was first enacted back in 1994. However, its funding lapsed during the government shutdown, and Congress later failed to pass an extension. Here to discuss the importance of the measure is Chief of Policy at the Tahirih Justice Center, Archi Pyati. She's dedicated her life to advocating for immigrant women and girls and calls the Violence Against Women Act a cornerstone of the nation's response to the epidemic of violence against women in the modern era. Archi, great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
How did this lapse? Why did this lapse?
So it's really unfortunate. You know, the Violence Against Women Act, as you've said, is such an important piece of legislation. It dates back to 1994, where we had robust bipartisan support to really establish foundational protections for women in this country who experience domestic violence and sexual assault. Over the years, every 5 years, it has to be reauthorized. And over the years, small tweaks have been made to really keep it updated and keep it relevant to what we know and understand about violence. What we know as a nation is that we want to stop violence against women. I don't think in this era of Me Too, anyone wants it to continue.
Right.
At the same time, unfortunately, the Violence Against Women Act can get caught in the crosshairs of partisan politics. And I think what we saw last year was an unwillingness of this Congress, the prior Congress, to really get VAWA reauthorized and reauthorize it with these very minor tweaks that needed to happen.
So what does the act do from a legislative perspective?
Yeah.
What does it do that is helpful? My understanding is that in all 50 states, violence against women is illegal, right?
Right.
So you, as it well should be, and the penalty should be severe. But domestic abuse is illegal in all 50 states. So what does the Violence Against Women Act? Why is it necessary?
Great. So it's a great question. So in 1994, when it was first passed, what was important about the Violence Against Women Act was that it created federal crimes. So it created the federal crimes of domestic violence and sexual assault. Over the years, dating violence and stalking have been added. So what we see then is that if you crossing state lines, for example, with somebody, with a minor or with an adult, for the purpose of perpetrating domestic violence, is not okay under a federal statute. We also have seen some of those state laws only were passed after the federal law came along. So it sets a tone across the country. It also established the Office of Violence Against Women inside the Department of Justice, which is critical. And it creates funding streams for really important programs like a hotline, for example, so that any victim anywhere in the country, regardless of where she lives, what she understands her rights to be, can access emergency services when she needs to reach out for help.
And so what were the tweaks here that have become controversial?
So, like I said, every 5 years it has to be reauthorized. The tweaks at times have been pretty significant. Mm-hmm. In the last reauthorization, in fact, what we accomplished, what advocates accomplished, was a change in jurisdiction for Native American women who are violated, who experience domestic violence at the hands of somebody who is a non-Native perpetrator. So 1 in 3 women, as we said already, will experience or has experienced intimate partner violence in America. If you're standing in line at a coffee shop, if you're waiting at the post office and you look left and right, there's a victim in the room with you. Every minute, 20 more people are being victimized. But even with those shocking numbers, what we've come to learn over the decades is that Native American women are twice as vulnerable to violence as the rest of us. Knowing that, then, shouldn't perpetrators who are non-Native perpetrators be held accountable under tribal jurisdiction when the violence happens on tribal lands? Seems like a no-brainer. That was something that was achieved in the last reauthorization, but it's somewhat limited and needs to be minorly expanded, and so that's up for discussion this time around. So that's one example. Another is a prohibitor that was put in place in '94 for gun ownership. So if you have, there are certain gun prohibitions against you if you are guilty of committing violence against women. If that is the case, then it should apply also when dating violence happens, not just domestic violence. That expansion still needs to happen. So there are a few minor sort of tweaks to expand a little bit, but they're not sea changes, they're really just technical fixes.
And what is the consequence of the fact that this is now lapsed? Does that mean that Native women who are abused by non-Native men on tribal reservation are not protected? Like, what does it mean that this is lapsed right now?
So thankfully, the lapse is not as dramatic as it sounds, in the sense, we need that robust reauthorization. We need funding streams in place. We need programs in place. When the law was first written in 1994, this reauthorization, the every 5 years, really, it creates this need to recommit. It asks us to, as a nation, say, yes, we again commit ourselves to ending violence against women, and it provides that opportunity to update and tweak the law as needed. So although nothing really has changed in the last few weeks since the lapse, the programs remain in place. What is important to realize is that we have an opportunity here, this being International Women's Day has just passed us. This is Women's History Month. We're really in a prime moment right now to recommit and take that step to make these tweaks.
And is your expectation that that will happen?
It is my hope, yes, absolutely. I think on both sides of the aisle there is an interest in reauthorizing VAWA. I think what remains to be seen is will everyone put their money where their mouth is, lean into this reauthorization process, allow the markup to go through without a whole lot of rollbacks or pushbacks, and make sure that we have a very robust reauthorization.
All right, Archi Pyati, thank you. Keep us updated.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
We'll have more Rising after this.